Kimberly Rios, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at Ohio University. I'm going to be talking to you today about quantitative research methods in the psychology of religion. I have a presentation prepared, and will share my screen with you in just a moment so that you can follow along with me more easily. So to give an overview of the presentation for today, I will first introduce the types of quantitative designs that are common in research, such as correlational studies, experiments, and quasi-experiments. I will go through a few examples of each type of design, as well as their advantages and potential disadvantages, and ways of addressing the disadvantages. I will then close by talking about how and when to involve collaborators in your research. I'll first start with correlational studies. This is a basic type of design that examines the relationships between two or more variables that are measured. These variables can be individual differences like personality variables and relevant to the topics that we study, things like degree of religiosity, conceptions of God as a more forgiving entity or a more punishing entity, etc. The measured variables can also include demographic categories, such as whether or not a participant identifies as Christian, whether they identify as male or female, whether they identify as white or black, etc. Oftentimes, correlational studies include covariates, which are additional variables that are measured as controls that may correlate with either the predictor variable or the outcome variable. Covariates are often included in order to address potential alternative explanations, as we'll talk about in a moment. In correlational studies, just as with any type of quantitative design, it's important to choose your measures very carefully so as to minimize potential confounds and alternative explanations for your results, and to ensure that you're measuring what you really want to be capturing. An example of a correlational study in psychology of religion research measured the relationship between conceptions of God and cheating behavior. The researchers specifically hypothesized that people who conceived God in more positive terms as a more forgiving entity would be more likely to engage in unethical behavior such as cheating because they would have the impression that God would forgive their sins. In order to examine this hypothesis, the researchers measured participants' views of God on both positive and negative qualities. They averaged the positive qualities like forgiving and loving, as well as the negative qualities like punishing and angry, together to form two separate scales of views of God. Then they looked at cheating behavior of participants as the outcome. Specifically, they had college student participants complete a really boring math test, and they said there was an error in the computer program whereby, unless they pressed the space bar to continue, the answer would show up to the math problem on the screen. So participants, in order not to cheat, had to press the space bar. And their cheating behavior was measured on each of the math problems in this way. The covariates that the researchers measured were participant sex, ethnicity, and degree of religious devotion. And they did this to make sure that cheating behavior would not be related to any demographic variables, and that the relationship between conceptions of God and cheating would hold regardless of how religious participants reported themselves to be. The results are shown right here, and specifically, I've highlighted the impact of what the researchers called the God negativity score on cheating behavior. And this was the difference between participants' negative views and positive views of God. so that higher scores mean greater perceptions of God as punishing relative to forgiving. In this study, participants who perceived God as more punishing and less forgiving were less likely to cheat on the task, whereas those who perceived God as more forgiving and less punishing were more likely to cheat. And this relationship was robust, even controlling for the covariates, religious devotion, ethnicity, and participant sex. Another example of a correlational study was actually a study my colleague and I conducted together on perceptions of atheist morality and prejudice against atheists. Previous research has shown that atheists are stereotyped as untrustworthy and immoral in many societies. But my colleague and I were specifically interested in what aspects of morality would tend to drive anti-atheist prejudice. That is, what aspects of morality are atheists perceived to lack? So, in order to do this, we measured participants' perceptions of atheists as immoral on 5 different dimensions or aspects of morality. Whether or not they tended to care about other people, whether or not they were fair to other people, whether or not they were loyal to members of their group, whether or not they were willing to comply with authority figures, and whether or not they were pure and demonstrated sanctity in their behaviors. Our outcome variable of interest was, of course, anti-atheist prejudice, which was measured by a variety of items such as society functions better if everyone believes in God. As control variables or covariates, my colleague and I measured both strength and belief in God with items like how confident are you that God exists, and political conservatism on social issues. And we did this because these types of measures might be related both to how participants conceive atheists' morality and their prejudice against atheists. And we wanted to make sure our results would remain even controlling for those variables. Our results are shown below, and they demonstrated that the more participants thought atheists cared about other people, the less prejudiced they were against atheists. This relationship held both in step 1, controlling for all the other aspects of morality that we measured, and even controlling for, in step 2 of this model, participants' social conservatism and degree of belief in God. So it appears that of all the aspects of morality, it was atheists' tendency to care or not to care about other people that drove participants' prejudice against them, or lack thereof. Correlational studies, just like any other type of quantitative design, have their advantages and potential disadvantages. One major advantage that I've personally found of correlational studies is that they can be great for exploratory and preliminary research questions. Correlational studies are relatively easy to run, so one can measure multiple variables, multiple outcomes, multiple covariates, even multiple predictors. Oftentimes, if I'm starting a new area of research, I'll run a correlational study first, just to see what relationships exist, and then I might follow up with experiments and quasi-experiments. But correlational studies also have their disadvantages. One of them is the problem of reverse causality. So even if you have a hypothesis about which variable will be the predictor and which will be the outcome, it could be in correlational studies that the predictor and outcome are actually reversed. For example, in the conceptions of God and cheating behavior study, it could be not that participants who saw God as forgiving were more likely to cheat, but that participants who were more likely to cheat to begin with then justified their behavior by saying that God was forgiving after the fact. There's also the problem of, in correlational studies, alternative explanations for the results. That is, third variables that might, in fact, explain what's going on. For example, if my colleague and I had not measured social conservatism or degree of belief in God, our results could have been explained by those variables instead of how participants were thinking about atheist morality in particular. So for this reason, it's important to choose your covariates wisely and carefully. That said, even if you choose covariates that you think are very appropriate, there still could be alternative explanations that you didn't account for. For instance, in my study on anti-atheist prejudice, there could be other variables besides conservatism and religiosity that my colleague and I should have measured that might explain the relationship between perceptions of atheists as uncaring and prejudice against atheists. Experimental designs are actually great for addressing these types of alternative explanations and isolating cause and effect. And they do so by changing just one aspect of the experimental design or procedure and seeing what difference that makes in how participants respond on the outcome, also known as the dependent variable. So in experimental designs, the predictor is called the independent variable, or the cause, and the outcome is called the dependent variable, or the effect. And in the most basic design, a sample of participants will be randomly assigned to either the experimental condition where the independent variable is present or a control condition where this variable is absent. And then both groups of participants will get the same dependent variable to respond to, and the differences between these groups will be compared. As I'll show you a little bit later, there are more complex versions of experimental design, but this is the simplest one. Some important elements of experimental designs that I will review with you as I go through example studies, first of all, are the importance of random assignment of participants to condition. So for example, if you're running an experiment in the lab, you might use a random number generator or flip a coin to determine whether participants go into the experimental condition or the control condition. This can help control for any individual differences between participants. In other words, we can assume that participants who are randomly put into the experimental and control groups are equal on things like age, that there's an equal number of men and women in each group, that they possess relatively equal levels of religiosity, or any other variable that you might care about. So because random assignment helps account for individual differences, it minimizes the need to include covariates or control variables in your study. Although sometimes in experiments, you might still want to do that to be safe. In experimental design, your choice of how to manipulate the independent variable or how to change that one aspect of the study that's different between groups is very important, and we'll talk about how to choose the right types of experimental and control conditions. We'll also talk about manipulation checks, which are measures designed to see whether the manipulation is producing the desired effects, whether it's creating the desired psychological state in participants. It's also important, of course, just as in correlational studies, to choose your measure of the dependent variable or outcome carefully. One example of an experiment that's actually a follow-up to the correlational study I presented earlier on conceptions of God and cheating behavior was a study in which participants were randomly assigned to two groups. In one group, they read a passage about God as a forgiving entity, and in the other group, they read a passage about God as relatively punishing. This was the experimental manipulation with two conditions to which, again, participants were randomly assigned. And I'll talk a little bit more about this manipulation in a bit. Participants, after they read the passage and wrote about their reactions to the passage of the Bible that they were assigned, were then told that they were going to complete a separate study that involved completing a word task. The word task was actually the measure of cheating behavior. The researchers set this up by giving participants some words to unscramble. Half of these words had actual solutions, and the other half had no solution, unbeknownst to participants. The researcher told participants that she had to leave for another appointment, and that in order to receive $1 for every word that they unscrambled correctly, they could take $1 for each correct solution from the envelope that she had left behind. And so cheating behavior was measured as the number of correct answers subtracted from the amount of money participants took from the envelope. So if they took $6 but only solved 5 of these word unscrambling tasks correctly, then they would have a cheating score of 1. It's very important in measuring any type of dependent variable to avoid floor effects or ceiling effects. And I say this because with the cheating task, it could have been, if the researchers had not been careful about how they measured cheating, that participants were unwilling to cheat no matter what and almost never did it, which is a floor effect, or that they always cheated on all the problems, which is a ceiling effect. In order to avoid these types of floor and ceiling effects, it's often advisable to conduct a pretest of whatever measure you would like to use. That is, to recruit a small group of participants to complete the measure and to make sure there are no potential issues with it, to make sure there is enough variability in how participants respond that you can conduct meaningful analyses of the data. As another point about this study, the reason that the researchers told participants that the word task and the Bible passage were part of 2 separate studies was a use of deception, which is often employed in experimental research when the experimenters want to make sure that participants behave as naturally and as normally as they would in everyday life. For instance, if participants had picked up on the fact that the Bible passage was connected to somehow to whether they would cheat on the task, they might have behaved in a way that tried to make themselves look good. But by telling participants that the 2 tasks were unrelated, this possibility was minimized. The particular passages that were used in order to manipulate participants' conceptions of God are depicted here. And these were both passages of about equal length, and they are about approximately equal in ease of understanding the passage, reading level, and so forth. And the researchers did this in order to minimize possible confounds or alternative explanations for the results. For instance, if the forgiving God passage had been a lot longer or a lot harder to understand than the punishing God passage, this could be one of those things, could be the reason for the results rather than the content of the passage and the conceptions of God itself. As a manipulation check, the researchers, after they had participants read the passages, or one of the 2 passages, had them rate how much the passage focused on God as being either forgiving or punishing on various measures or various items. And indeed, they found that participants who read the passage about God as forgiving rated it as more forgiving and less punishing in content than those who read the punishing passage. So this ensures that the manipulation worked as was intended and that it changed the psychological state, perceptions of God as forgiving versus punishing, that the researchers intended. The results of this particular study are depicted here. So as was found in the correlational study, the researchers demonstrated that the passage about God as forgiving led to more cheating behavior than the passage about God as punishing. But this time, because it's an experimental design, we have evidence of a cause and effect relationship, unlike in the correlational study. Let me take a moment here, though, to talk about the importance of choosing appropriate control conditions. In this case, the researchers were simply interested in comparing different conceptions of God as forgiving or as punishing. But you might also wonder, was it really that perceptions of God as forgiving increased cheating behavior, or did perceptions of God as punishing decrease cheating behavior? Which condition here really is driving the effects? And in order to answer this question, if we were interested, we would need a true control condition in which, for example, participants read a neutral passage about God or even no passage at all. Depending on how the results of that hypothetical control condition would look, we could draw different conclusions about the data. For instance, if we ran a control condition that looked very similar to the punishing God condition, we could conclude that indeed, forgiving gods increased cheating behavior. But if, instead, we had found that the control condition looked more similar to the forgiving God condition, we would instead need to conclude that perceptions of God as punishing actually decrease cheating behavior. Just as an elaboration of what the researchers that published this paper actually did, here in one of their follow-up studies are some control conditions that they decided to add. They decided to include both a neutral passage in which participants didn't read about either forgiveness or punishment, and two conditions in which participants read about a friend who either forgave or punished their friend for a transgression that was committed. And they did this both to include a true control condition, as I was discussing on the last slide, and to address the possibility that simply reading about forgiveness or reading about punishment was the reason for the effects, and not reading about God specifically. But as these results show here, given that the forgiving God condition produced so much more cheating than any of the other conditions, we can reasonably conclude that it's perceptions of God in particular as forgiving that is leading participants to cheat more. Here's a more complex experimental design that was actually a follow-up to the correlational study I presented before on morality and anti-atheist prejudice. My colleague and I decided that we wanted to experimentally manipulate participants' perceptions of atheist morality or lack thereof. And we did this by having participants read what was supposedly a news article describing past research findings. And the news article related to a particular aspect of morality, either caring about others or sanctity and purity, that was related to atheists. Participants read that atheists either did or did not endorse this particular aspect of morality that they read about. So in this particular design, there are two independent variables, that is, two aspects of the procedure that are independently changed to see what difference it makes on the dependent variable. The first is the aspect of morality that participants read about, and the second is whether or not atheists were described as endorsing that aspect. So in this design, this is referred to as a 2 by 2 because there are two levels or two conditions within each independent variable. And there are 4 conditions total, hence 2 times 2 equals 4. This type of experimental design helps address potential confounds that my colleague and I wanted to control for. For example, by including both caring about others and endorsing sanctity and purity as two different aspects of morality that we manipulated, we can ensure that it's not just thinking about atheists as moral or immoral in general that produces the results. It's thinking about atheists in relation to a particular aspect of morality. And similarly, we manipulated whether atheists were described as endorsing or not endorsing that particular aspect of morality that participants read about, in order to make sure that it's really about atheists' levels, whether atheists are perceived as moral or immoral on those dimensions, not just whether participants are thinking about atheists in the first place at all. Our dependent variables, similar to the correlational study, were both distrust toward and prejudice against atheists. And I'm showing you the results here on both the distrust and the prejudice toward atheists dependent variables, but they show essentially the same thing. And the data, consistent with open science practices that have recently become common in psychology of religion, are publicly available on Open Science Framework. Dr. Ladd will be talking to you shortly about how to make your data publicly available and how to adhere to open science practices in other ways. Back to the results, they show that participants who thought that atheists endorsed the notion of caring about other people were more trusting and less prejudiced toward atheists than those who thought atheists didn't endorse notions of caring for other people. And there were no differences in anti-atheist prejudice or distrust according to whether or not participants thought atheists endorsed notions of sanctity and purity. So again, conceptually replicating our correlational study, we found that it's notions of atheists not caring about others, so that particular aspect of morality, that leads to anti-atheist prejudice. And now we have evidence of this cause and effect relationship. One really notable advantage of experimental designs is that, presuming that the experiment is in fact designed well, they can be very high in internal validity. That is, they have the ability to isolate the cause and the effect because only one aspect of the independent variable or variables is manipulated. But if you're not careful, experiments can be low, relatively speaking, in external validity. That is, it's important for experiments to resemble the real world and what participants might normally experience in everyday life as much as possible. There are ways for researchers to do this. For example, in the cheating task in the Conceptions of God and Cheating Behavior study, the researcher actually left the room and left real money in an envelope next to participants to monitor whether they would cheat in a supposedly real situation. And in my colleagues in my study, we made an effort to make the passage that participants read about atheists' morality, or lack thereof, as realistic as possible to make it sound as much as we could like an actual newspaper article reporting research results. Another type of design that's common in quantitative research is quasi-experiments. Quasi-experiments can be thought of as a combination of correlational and experimental studies in their pros and cons. And the first type of quasi-experiment that I'll discuss is the person by treatment design. And this is a design in which we have an independent variable that's measured, as in correlational studies, as well as an independent variable that's manipulated, as in experiments. This type of design can be really useful if we're interested in differences between groups in how they respond to particular situations. For example, the researchers in the Conceptions of God and Cheating Behavior study might have been interested in whether these effects are strongest among people who are highly religious, because people who are not particularly religious might not be as affected by a passage about God from the Bible. Similarly, in my study with my colleague on anti-atheist prejudice, we might have asked whether Christians show the effect more so than non-Christians. That is, Christians might be more affected by information about atheist morality than people who don't consider themselves Christian or particularly religious. A real example, though, of a quasi-experiment is actually from my own research about stereotypes of Christians in science. In the United States and many Western societies, there's a widespread notion that Christianity and science do not go together and that they are in conflict. I was interested in seeing whether Christians who read about stereotypes of their religion conflicting with science would then perform worse on a task described as measuring scientific reasoning than if they read about their religion being compatible with science. In order to test this prediction, I recruited participants who identified as either Christian or non-Christian, and I had them read a passage that described Christianity and science as either coexisting or in conflict with each other. So the passage that participants read was the experimental manipulation, or the treatment variable, and whether or not participants were Christian was the person variable, or the measured variable. Participants then completed a task that was described as a measure of scientific reasoning, and I computed the number of correct answers that they provided as the dependent variable. Also, just to back up a little bit, as a manipulation check, I asked participants after they read the passage how compatible they personally believed Christianity was with science. And participants who had read the passage about Christianity and science coexisting did rate their religion as more compatible with science than those who read the passage about Christianity and science conflicting, suggesting that the manipulation produced the desired psychological state. Here are the results from this particular study, and you'll see in the note on the bottom that this study was pre-registered, and the pre-registration and data are available on Open Science Framework. Again, this is getting to be a more common practice in psychological research, and Dr. Ladd will walk you through how to do these things in your own work. Back to the results. Again, this was a 2x2 design, and the results show that Christians performed worse on the science test than non-Christians when they read the passage about religion and science being incompatible, but they performed equally well as non-Christians when they read the passage about Christianity and science being compatible. Another example of a person by treatment design is also a study that I did with a colleague, a former student of mine. And this was about different religious groups' trust in scientists. We wanted to see, because science is stereotyped as very secular in the United States, and atheists are a distrusted group, whether Christian participants would trust scientists less if they were identified as atheists than if they identified as any religion. We also wanted to see whether atheist participants would show the reverse effect. That is, whether atheist participants would trust atheist scientists more than scientists with religious backgrounds. In order to test these predictions, we recruited both atheist and Christian participants. So that was our person variable. We randomly assigned these participants to one of 3 different conditions in which they read a passage about a scientist who was identified as either Christian, atheist, or Jewish. This was our treatment variable, or the experimental manipulation. We included the Jewish condition in order to rule out the possibility that Christians simply trust members of their in-group, that is, other Christians, more than members of any out-group, such as Jews or atheists. Our dependent variable was how much participants rated the scientists described as trustworthy. And the results are depicted here. This is, again, a person by treatment design, but this time the person variable has 2 levels, atheist and Christian, and the treatment variable has 3 levels, the atheist, Christian, or Jewish scientist. Thus, this is a 2 by 3 design. For atheist participants, the atheist scientist was trusted significantly more than either the Christian or Jewish scientist. And for Christian participants, the atheist scientist was trusted less than either the Christian or Jewish scientists, who did not differ from each other. Another type of quasi-experiment that I want to briefly touch on is the field study. And this involves manipulating the independent variable as a function of some aspect of the environment that occurs naturally. So this has the advantage of being externally valid, that is, being relevant to what people might experience in the real world, but the researchers may have more or less control over how this variable is manipulated. As a couple of examples, in one study that I did with my colleagues, we had participants complete a measure of scientific reasoning in either the physics building or the divinity school of their university. And because we randomly assigned participants to complete the test in one of these 2 areas, we did have control over our experimental manipulation. And so we could use random assignment. In another study, however, participants were asked to complete a measure of prejudice against different outgroups, either in front of a religious building like a church or in front of a neutral building that was non-religious, such as a bank. In this case, participants could not be randomly assigned to condition because the researchers simply approached whoever happened to be standing in front of the building. So in this case, there was a little bit less control over the manipulation, although there still is high external validity in that participants were actually in that environment. To summarize each type of design that I've discussed today, correlational studies can be a good place to start for exploratory or preliminary research. And whenever you conduct correlational studies, you should think very carefully about which covariates or control variables to include in order to address possible confounds, that is, alternative explanations. Out of all the types of designs that I've covered, experiments have the least potential for confounds and the most internal validity, that is, ability to isolate cause and effect if they're designed well, but they can also lack external validity. And so for this reason, it's important that experiments, as much as possible, mimic what participants might experience in the real world. Quasi-experiments can be broken down into both person by treatment designs, which are a feasible option if you're interested in how different groups of people respond to particular manipulations or situations, and field studies, which arguably have the highest external validity because you're testing participants in a naturally occurring environment outside of a laboratory. But regardless of which type of design you ultimately choose, you might consider adopting multiple methods in future research. For example, in a lot of my work, I start out by conducting a correlational study and then building upon those results by incorporating experimental designs and sometimes a field study. Before we adjourn, I'd like to discuss a little bit about how you can determine the sample sizes in your research. In general, for experiments, the more experimental conditions you have and the more experimental manipulations you incorporate in your design, the larger the sample that is required. And for correlational studies, the more variables that you measure, the more predictors you have, the larger the sample you need. Now, currently, the rough norms in social psychology, which is my field of research, are about 50 or more participants per condition. So if you have a 2x2 experimental or quasi-experimental design with 4 different conditions, you would need at least 200 participants. But this is a general rule of thumb. This should not be taken as a hard and fast rule. Sample sizes, if you can get more than 50 per condition, that can be optimal. If you cannot get more than that, if you have to get a little bit fewer than that because you're working with a population that's not accessible, sometimes that can be acceptable. It really just depends. And it also depends on the type of effect size that you're looking at. There's a statistical software tool called GPower 3.1 that you can download from the web. This statistical tool can help you determine what sample size you would need given the particular size of the effect that you're anticipating, what your design is, how many covariates you have, and so forth. And this is a very useful tool to use prior to collecting any data. I'd also like to briefly run through the differences between participants and within participants' independent variables. All the independent variables that I discussed so far have been between participants. That is, participants are randomly assigned in experiments or field studies to one of 2 or more groups. But in cases where there are within subjects independent variables, this means that participants are assigned to all of the different conditions. Now, this isn't always possible, so it wouldn't have been feasible, for example, in the cheating study for participants to read the forgiving God passage and then complete the cheating task, then read the punishing God passage and complete another cheating measure. But sometimes it actually is possible to design studies with within participants' IVs. For example, my colleague and I have conducted studies in which we asked participants both about perceptions of atheist morality and perceptions of Christians' morality. So the type of group about which participants were answering questions is a within subjects independent variable. Similarly, there was a study recently conducted in which participants answered questions about each member of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, instead of being randomly assigned to answer questions about just one. Some advantages of within participants' independent variables are that they require smaller sample sizes overall because all participants are randomly assigned are randomly assigned to each of the conditions. Because each participant completes all the conditions, they essentially serve as their own control group. So we need to worry less in within participants' designs about individual differences variables that might serve as alternative explanations or confounds in our studies. However, between participants' independent variables can have important advantages. If we have a lot of different experimental conditions, it can get redundant and tiresome for participants to complete all of them. So, for example, if my colleague and I had measured perceptions of atheists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus' morality, we might have wanted a between participants design instead, because participants would have been completing the same questionnaire over and over again for multiple groups. With between participants independent variables, these variables also minimize the chance that one of the conditions will affect other subsequent conditions that participants complete. For instance, whereas in a design where participants answer questions about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, it's possible that answering questions about God the Father first could influence how they respond to the questions about the Son or the Holy Ghost. And within subjects' designs, though, in order to address this possibility, it's important to counterbalance, that is, randomize the order in which participants see the different conditions. So indeed, in the Holy Trinity study, participants saw the questions about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost in random order. Finally, I'd like to briefly discuss how to choose collaborators in your research and when to choose collaborators. In general, if you are relatively unfamiliar with a particular methodology that you're thinking of using, a population you'd like to investigate, or simply don't have experience measuring or manipulating the variables that you're interested in studying, it's a good idea to seek outside help. Also, if you really want to access a population that is not readily available where you live or where you work, collaborations can be useful. It's important to choose collaborators who have similar interests and are therefore interested in working on a project with you, but who have complementary skill sets so that you can learn from one another. A couple of personal examples of collaborations for me have been particularly illuminating. First of all, my work on morality and anti-atheist prejudice is conducted in collaboration with somebody who's an expert on various aspects of morality. So he was able to tell me how to measure these aspects of morality appropriately, whereas I'm more of an expert on anti-atheist prejudice, so I introduced a lot of measures of prejudice to him that he would not have thought of otherwise. Similarly, I'm working on a project right now on racial and ethnic differences and gratitude to God in the US. My collaborator on this project teaches at a historically Black college, which my university is mostly white in their population, so I would not have access to Black students, nor would I really know how to ask particular questions for that population. By working with a colleague who has expertise and familiarity, as well as access to this population, we can more easily capitalize on each other's strengths. So finally, I've discussed a variety of quantitative research designs with you, as well as gone over some things to consider when putting together a study or a grant proposal. But if you have any questions or would like to reach out to me about either anything that I said in this presentation or the possibility of collaboration, please feel free to reach out to me at the email that I provided. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye.